So I want to begin by returning the thanks. The World Affairs Council is most grateful to all of the help of the entire team at Eastern State Penitentiary for partnering with us on tonight's program. And I also want to thank the Stan and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation, SEI and UGI for their sponsorship of the Council's Great Debates series, which tonight's program is the last installment of that series for our 2017-2018 program season. I also want to thank our guests in the remote viewing area down the hall by Al Capone's cell, who are watching by live stream. We promise not to forget and leave you here. As you know, as you were told in your registration materials, tonight's program will be filmed and used for an episode of the Council's public broadcasting series, The Whole Truth with David Eisenhower. You'll know more or less as we go through this when the cameras are on and off. They will be off during the Q&A session where you all will have an opportunity to ask some questions of the panel. But the entirety of the proceedings is being filmed this evening for C-SPAN. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that a last-minute scheduling conflict has kept the chief of Philadelphia's Defender Association, Keir Bradford Gray, from joining us tonight, as both she and we had hoped. But we obviously have a great group here on this issue, and we will proceed. So with that, I just want to make sure that our Whole Truth cameras are rolling. Excellent. Okay. Thank you, David. Joining us for this discussion at the historic Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia are Mr. Robert Listenbee, First Assistant District Attorney of Philadelphia, Mr. Paul Butler, the Albert Brick Professor in Law at Georgetown University School of Law, Mr. Jeffrey Brown, President and CEO of Brown Superstores and the founder of UpLift Solutions, and Mr. Mark Holden, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries. Welcome, all of you. I want to start by going around the panel, and we'll start with you, Bob, and ask you just for some opening thoughts, kind of frame for us your view of this topic, how best to reform American criminal justice beyond mass incarceration.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here to talk about what I consider one of the most important topics of our times. That is addressing the issue of mass incarceration and also addressing the issue of mass supervision, parole and probation. Larry Krasner was elected on a platform that focused on ending mass incarceration, ending it because it's wrong, ending it because we've placed too many people in jail, in the county jails and the state prison, without any direct impact upon community safety, placing too many people in jail, in the process destroying families and destroying communities. Also recognizing that it costs enormous sums of money to keep people in jail. If you look on the financial side, we know that in Philadelphia, in the county jail, it costs about $42,000 a year to place someone in the jail and keep them there. We know that those costs are approximately the same as hiring a new police officer, hiring a new fire person, a new teacher. And we know that our schools are suffering because we don't have enough funds, and we're always challenged to find funds for our firemen and our police officers. We also know that when talking about mass incarceration, we must not forget the juvenile justice side, because we have large numbers of youth in our juvenile justice systems. We are often finding, based upon the research that we've seen, that they are dramatically and negatively impacted by being placed in facilities outside their homes, often 300 and 400 miles away from their families. That these young people, we're spending about $215,000 per year per child for secure confinement in the state of Pennsylvania, and that these children come back worse off than they were when they went. Why? Because we mix children who are at low risk of reoffending with children who are at high risk. Why? Because we don't give them adequate education while they're away. We bring them back without transitioning them to schools where they can get a good education, and also without getting credits. Why? Because they're separated from the schools here, come back, and most of them don't go back to schools. In Larry Krasner's shop, we're doing several things. I'll touch on them briefly, and we can come back with questions later on. First, we're focusing on bail reform, working in conjunction with the mayor, so that low-level offenders, low-level offenses, people with low-level offenses and small amounts of bail are being released in the city, and the city is now in a position to close the House of Corrections based upon the project that was started by the mayor and worked with by Mr. Krasner. We're also focusing on declining certain kinds of offenses to be prosecuted, including small amounts of marijuana, focusing on expunging records because that really does help folks get back and reestablish their lives after they've been incarcerated. Thank you very much for just opening comments. More questions later on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Butler, and I represent the people. That's how I used to start my opening statement. I was a prosecutor. I represented the government in criminal court in the District of Columbia, and I used that power to put black men in prison, and black women, Latino people, poor people. Like a lot of prosecutors, that was pretty much all I did. During the time that I did that work, I learned some things that changed the ways that I felt about my responsibilities as an American, as an African American, and as a person who wants to make a difference in this world. One of the concerns I had was about race. If you go to a criminal court in the District of Columbia and Philadelphia and New York, you would think that white people don't commit crime. They're a percentage of the city, but they're not present in the criminal court in the way that black and brown people are. And I understood that that was a problem. And when I looked at some of the data, that there are more African American people now under criminal justice supervision than there were slaves in 1850. That if you're a black man who didn't graduate from high school, you're in your 40s, you're more likely to be incarcerated than you are to have a job. 1 million souls, 1 million African American people are in prison. And so when I think about what needs to be done, I think reform is not ambitious enough. It's not ambitious enough, for one, if we think about the numbers. So I'm sure we'll get into this, like what reform means. But if we're thinking about like not locking up non-violent drug offenders, there's a very robust proposal from the New York University Brennan Center that talks about letting 40% of the people who are now incarcerated go home tomorrow. That's reform. We don't have the political will to do that, but one day we might. So what would our world look like if 40% of our inmates were no longer in prison? The United States would still be the world's leading jailer, and race disparities would get worse, not better. So I don't think we should think about reform. I think we should think about transformation. If we think about the great struggles for racial justice in our country, they've all been struggles about abolition. Abolition of slavery, abolition of the old Jim Crow. Now is the time to imagine abolition of the new Jim Crow. So I look forward to talking to you about what that would mean.
Thank you. Yes.
So our journey in the criminal justice reform really started with a different objective. 15 years ago, I'm a fourth generation grocer, by the way, and 15 years ago, the state was looking at the access to healthy and affordable food versus your life expectancy. And there's over 100 studies to suggest that even a mile or two apart, primarily people of color that are low income will live 15 to 20 years less than my kids will live. And the evidence was presented to me that if only we could get everybody access to fresh, affordable food, we could substantially narrow the life expectancy. So I started out with that objective in mind, and we started opening big, beautiful, full-service supermarkets in underprivileged neighborhoods. And we weren't sure exactly how to do it, and so we started out with town hall meetings. And we'd have town hall meetings. As a CEO, I would lead the meeting, and people would tell me what their problems were, the kind of experiences they had with business, with government, and other institutions that have failed them. they'd give me a list of homework. And along the way, as we were opening these stores, one of my customers and community leaders gave me a really good education on the criminal justice system from her perspective and helped me to understand why it should matter to me. Not that it didn't matter to me before, but I don't think I was informed as much as I should, considering the work that I did. And what she said was that, God bless you, you're opening stores, no one else will. We really appreciate that. But you know, we're never going to be the greatest customers because so many of us have been incarcerated. And once you've been incarcerated, no one will hire you. So you're basically serving people that always are going to live on government entitlements, or a lot of the population will. And we're worried you won't make it. And so we're not sure who to go to, but we think you should fix this problem. And of course, I have to admit that a number of my executives were a little concerned about the fact that I probably would want to. And we were thinking about how to approach that. And we figured jump in head first, that's the only way to do it. And we went and hired a half a dozen returning citizens in the next store we were about to open 15 years ago. And to our surprise, we loved the half a dozen people we hired. And some of them went on relatively quickly to be management, making 50, 60, or 70,000 a year with very good performance. And very few were a problem. So we hired another dozen. And today, 15 years later, 500 of my 3,000 employees are returning citizens. So we have direct experience. I think that's why I was asked here. And we have data. A couple of years ago, we got a grant. We do have a national nonprofit that does food access work. And we got a grant to take what we learned in our supermarket business and to do it for the greater good of society. And a couple of years ago, we opened a workforce center in Enon Baptist Church, which is the biggest church in Philadelphia. And we put a professional team together, and we started to collect data. And what we've discovered is in almost every way, our returning citizen students have outperformed the general population in almost everything a business would be concerned about, whether it's retention rates, work performance, months to promotion, ultimate career attainment, outperforming. And it doesn't really sound logical that that would be true at first, except for you're dealing with a population that has experienced real suffering, real trauma, and it's been incarcerated, doesn't want to go back to jail. And to begin with, they probably went to jail because they were more ambitious than average, but didn't have an opportunity to do it the right way. And so I think, you know, what we've learned is this is a massive number of people that were written off that are misunderstood. And all they want to do is take that ambition and use it for the right thing. They didn't have a chance. And we found the vast majority of all of the returning citizens we hired to be successes, and nowhere near our general population. And so we're really excited about what we discovered, and I'm excited tonight to talk about some of our learnings.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Holden. I'm with Koch Industries, and it's really an honor to be here tonight talking about criminal justice issues, criminal justice reform issues. I agree with Paul. We need to fundamentally transform what we're doing. Nipping around the edges hasn't worked, won't work, and there's so much that needs to happen. And it's not just in our criminal justice system, and it's in all parts of our society. And it really starts with community. So it's great to see a community here today, because that is ultimately what will get us where we need to go. So a little bit about me. I'm with Koch Industries. I've been very fortunate to work there for 23 years. Charles Koch and David Koch. We've hired people with criminal records since I've been with the company, so going on 23 years. And we continue to do it to this day. We do it because it's the right thing to do, but we do it because it gives us a competitive advantage, we really feel. Now, you look at our current criminal justice system, the way it's set up, and it's the ultimate failed big government program, picks winners and losers. It's a pay-to-play system. If you're rich and guilty, as Brian Stevenson says, you're going to be okay. It treats them better than the poor and the innocent. So when you look at the number of people in our country with a criminal record, some estimates are 1 in 3. So that's 1 in 3 people have a criminal record, which is as many, if not more, people with a criminal record than have a college degree in this country. So from a perspective of an employer, a global employer like us with 120,000 employees around the world, if we were to say, you know what, we're not going to look at 1/3 of the applicant pool, that's really stupid. So this is all about, from our perspective, removing barriers to opportunity, eliminating injustices, equal justice, giving second chances to people, and mutual benefit. And so what we've seen is people who have criminal records are among our best employees because they're hungry, humble, you name it. They need a second chance, they want a second chance. So we're really focused on that. We're really focused on every aspect of the criminal justice system and the repairs that need to be made. I mean, you start from the front end, we talk about bail. I mean, somehow in this country we've decided that the amount of money that someone has is a proxy for public safety. It's crazy. So bail reform, I know you're doing a lot here on that. I mean, we should go back to the warning that is contained in the 8th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, that bail is allowed, but make sure it's not excessive. That was a warning. Some people interpret that, particularly in the bail industry, as saying, see, you have a constitutional right to bail. That's not what they're saying. They're saying this is it's available, but let's watch it because it's a way for people to be locked up and pretrial detention. And as we know, in our country, the norm, the default setting is liberty and freedom, and anything less than that is carefully is a careful calculus to make sure that doesn't happen, including with bail. But every part of the system, from the bail system to the power of prosecutors to the lack of indigent defense lawyers, Sixth Amendment rights. I'm sorry, Kara isn't here. I met with her last January. She came in hot on me, man. She kind of scared me, but she's really a great advocate. But Sixth Amendment rights aren't honored for people who need a defense lawyer, who can't afford one. And we know 80% or plus more of the people in the system need a defense lawyer appointed to them by the court. You look at the sentencing issues, you look at the way prisons are, where we warehouse people, and then you look at reentry, where after you've paid your debt to society and we should welcome you back, we don't. We've got 42,000 or more collateral consequences in this country to a criminal conviction that keep people from jobs, they keep them from housing, they keep them from loans, they keep them from education, you name it. So the system is exactly set up the opposite way it should be, and we need to fix it. We shouldn't be nipping around the edges. We are doing that. We are making some progress, but it's not enough, and we need to do more. So I'm excited to be here tonight, and I'm looking forward to having a great discussion around these issues. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's Great Debate Series, and it's a TV show called The Whole Truth. So it's my job to play devil's advocate and to ask some questions to challenge the consensus of this group. Bob, I want to start with you. So right here in this neighborhood where we sit tonight, and throughout downtown Philadelphia, and I think it would be replicated in the central portion of basically every city in the United States. It is true that the statistics about violent crime are relatively unchanged from before the Get Tough period. But it's also true, or at least I would offer the proposition that it's true, that the kind of sort of palpable fear that people had about their safety and their property in the late 80s, early 90s, the period particularly of the crack epidemic, has gone away. And that people feel much more safe in this and other similar communities. So I guess my question is, what do you think is wrong? What's mistaken in the narrative that says the tough-on-crime approach, including increased incarceration of nonviolent offenders, that it worked and that it has given, particularly in the center of our cities where people want to live, work, and play, an atmosphere of greater security? What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I guess I would say that in looking at the argument, there are a lot of assumptions made. There's an assumption that the people who were arrested and placed in jail were people who were likely to reoffend. The statistics don't show that. A lot of people who were placed in jail were low-risk offenders, or low risk at reoffending. They were placed in jail for long periods of time. Studies show that if you place people in jail for longer periods of time than quote-unquote necessary, you're more likely to cause them to enter a life of crime and stay in a life of crime than you are if you put them in for shorter periods of time. We know that if they're there for shorter periods of time, they're more likely to stay in contact with their families, their communities, more likely to stay in contact with opportunities for education, jobs, and that kind of thing. Putting away for long periods of time put them in a culture of crime, and often it just doesn't turn out to be the best kind of thing. We know also that there's been poor examples involving young people. We put large numbers of young people in jail. The arrests were twice as high back in the 90s as they are now. The crime wave among young people ended back in 1994, and crime has been going down since 94, but the arrests kept going up for another 10 years. So we've kind of missed the curve. We're not using a scientific basis for deciding which people to put away, deciding how long to put them away, deciding what we're going to do when they come back, and making sure that they have the kind of resources to re-enter the community and be successful. Until we do that, we're really just causing greater problems for our society than we need to.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul, let me turn to your comment that your job as a prosecutor was very largely putting men of color in prison. Clearly, there's no question that there is a great disproportion, great disparity in the rates of incarceration between the races. So maybe that is evidence, as many people believe, of systemic racism. And perhaps the consequence of that is that fewer people of color should be in prison. But how would you react to the sort of the proposition that what it really shows is that we're not putting enough white people in prison? In other words, that there are all kinds of crimes, powder cocaine versus crack cocaine being a famous example, but all kinds of crimes, white-collar crimes on Wall Street and so on, that are not appropriately punished, and that should be the focus, is appropriately punishing anybody, regardless of color, for crimes, rather than attempting to undo it the other way.
Yeah, so again, I can also think about the first question, because in part it has to do with the reasons why crime goes up and crime goes down. And you mentioned that it's an empirical question. That's right, and we don't know. Researchers don't know. So you hear different theories about why sometimes, like in the 80s, crime goes down, and why now in 2010, crime went up in the 80s and now it's gone down. Why is that? You've heard the theories, right? So some people say it's demographic. It's about the number of young men who are in the population. Other people say, well, no, it has more to do with the economy. Some people blame environmental factors like lead paint. Sometimes folks look at the law. There's a famous theory about the availability of abortion and that's impact. We don't know. So another theory has to do with incarceration. That a reason that crime has gone down is because we're locking more people up. We know that can't be the whole story or most of the story. One way we know that is because not only has crime gone down in cities that have locked up a lot of people, crime has gone down in cities that haven't used incarceration as their crime control strategy. And check this out. Crime has gone down all over the Western world, not just in the United States, but in virtually every country in the world. Why is that? The answer, my friends, is we don't know. So incarceration is a theory. I think it's a weak theory in part because when you look at what's going on in some of our states, more activity with regard to what we're talking about reform on the state level than the federal level. And so now we've got about 25 states that have actually reduced their rates of incarceration. And guess what? Crime in those states have gone down. In some instances, crime in states that have let people go home have gone down quicker than in states that are continuing to lock up a lot of people. So that's pretty compelling evidence that the rate of incarceration doesn't have a whole lot to do with the crime rate. And that brings us to my brothers, to the African-American men who disproportionately feel our prison cells. What's up with that? Why are black men about 6% of the population, almost 50% of the prison population? Let's understand it's not because they're black. Black people do not commit crime because of the color of their skin. So we think about what makes people at risk for committing the kinds of violent crime that drive prison admissions. two things. Living in a high poverty, segregated neighborhood, 7 out of 8 of the people who live in those neighborhoods are black or brown, plus guns, easy access to guns. You add those two things, that's a recipe for people being at risk for being victims of crime and for being perpetrators of crime. So we could think about the failed war on drugs. There you have an obvious case for selective prosecution. That's discrimination, right? So I'm a university professor. It doesn't surprise me to know that black folks don't use drugs more than anybody else. If in DC I go to the National Institute of Health, how many people use drugs? They say 13% of people who use drugs are black. About 13% of our population is also African American. What about sellers? Well, most people who buy drugs, it's kind of a segregated transaction. Most people who buy drugs say they buy them from someone at their own risk. If you go, again in DC, if I go from the National Institute of Health, jump on the red line, go to the Justice Department, who's locked up for drug crimes? 60% are black. 13% of people who do the crime, 60% of people who do the time. And so when we look at what's going on, we can talk about discrimination, selective prosecution with regard to drug crimes. But when we look at the crimes that people are mainly admitted to state prison, those are violent offenses, which mothers are disproportionately actually guilty of. And so when we think about ways to respond to that, again, it's all about getting rid of the hood. It's all about providing opportunities where people don't feel that they have to resort to crime. And there's ways we could do that at the end of his administration. President Obama said, well, I don't want to talk about reparations. What I do want to talk about is a Marshall Plan for the inner city. People say, oh, that'd be too expensive. We're spending that much money right now, my friends. In the Bronx, they have what they call $1 million blocks. That means if you look at the people on this one block, that's how much money the state is spending to lock up people. That one block. There's a, I won't say beautiful map. It's no more beautiful than this prison is beautiful. But if you look at it, New York City, Justice Mapping Project, all these $1 million blocks. I guess the last thing I'll say is, what if? What if rather than spending that money to put people in cages, you spend it on health care, on education, on job training? Not for lawyers. I don't have a hard time in DC finding a lawyer. I can't find a plumber. If we can get people to do that work, that keeps people out of prison.
Thank you. Mark, I want to jump over to you.
Skip to you.
Yeah, we're coming back. I want to ask you for your thoughts on how this issue of criminal justice reform and the need for criminal justice reform become the bipartisan unicorn of our time, right? We live in such a polarized time. How did this issue become somewhat unifying in terms of our politics? And secondly, how is the position, and you've already alluded to this a bit, but I'd like you to elaborate if you can. How is the position that you and Koch Industries takes on this quote-unquote conservative? How does it fit in an overall conservative worldview?
Yeah. Well, the first part I'd say it's really, from my perspective, this shouldn't be a left or right, a progressive, a conservative issue. This is just a common sense issue. This is citizens helping each other, a community issue. It's, for me, it shouldn't be partisan at all, criminal justice reform. Of course, it's been so politicized over the last 30 or 40 years. It has been. I think that whatever your particular political ideology or party or whatever you think about different issues, everybody basically believes in fairness at some level. You know, we talk about it different ways maybe, but what we're talking about is a fair system. What we're talking about is something very important, a criminal justice system which is designed to keep us safe, to keep communities safe. When you look at what's happened the last 30 or 40 years, we haven't been made safer by it. It hasn't been a safer situation. As we've been talking about, some neighborhoods in particular have been ravaged and continue to be ravaged. So we can't say we've made it any safer. So both sides look at that and say what we're doing isn't working. And that's led to left and right coming together to make the reforms in the states in particular, and somewhat at a slower rate at the federal level. I want to go back to one thing that Paul was talking about in the states in particular. It's pretty amazing. Red state Texas, hang 'em high Texas. Under Governor Rick Perry, they started reforms back in 2007. They've now, in the last 10 years, they have closed 8 prisons. They have a crime rate that they haven't seen this low since the 1960s, and they've saved $4 billion in taxpayer money. And they've done this not by what we did back in the 80s and 90s based on who could be tougher on crime and who's soft on crime and all that nonsense. They didn't do it on fear and emotion like we did back in the 80s and 90s. Both parties did it, unfortunately. It's a disgrace. What they did was go on basic evidence-based practices and data, driving it. And they started in Texas thinking about who really needs to be in prison. What is a prison for? To punish someone. Well, someone who's sick, someone who's mentally ill, someone who makes a dumb mistake but isn't, it can be maybe dealt with outside of prison. Let's try to divert them. And then the people in prison, let's help them be less violent, less troubled. They need therapy. Many people who commit violent crimes are broken inside themselves, have been the victims of trauma. So focusing on those issues, focusing on education, focusing on vocational training. So all these common sense things. And once Texas started doing it, I think that gave all sides, all the states, red and blue, permission to do it. It was like Nixon to China or whatever. You weren't going to get Willie Horton. It made sense. And then you saved a lot of money. And the money that you saved could be used for things much better than locking people up who don't need to be locked up for so long. So the common sense part of it came to, and then it led to these different coalitions like we've been involved in with. We work with the NAACP, we work with the Center for American Progress, ACLU, you name it, and we work with groups on FreedomWorks and Heritage Foundation, whoever wants to help here. So that's what's led to this commonality coming up, and for the last 10, 15 years. And the states that have done it have shown that you can reduce incarceration rates, you can reduce crime rates, you can reduce recidivism rates, you can reduce spending. And we're not spending now more money like we do in a lot of states, or we have over the past several years. We spend 3 to 4 times more per capita on locking people up than we do on educating them in this country, on K through 12 education. That's all starting to shift. So your other question, how did we come to this? How did Koch get around to it, or why are we involved? Well, it gets back to fundamental liberty. It gets back to just common sense. From my perspective, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. The best job I ever had before I went to law school, I was a prison guard. And when I was working in the prison, there were a bunch of kids I grew up with who were incarcerated. And they were, classmates in junior high and high school, and they were knuckleheads, and they did really dumb things, and they ended up becoming drug addicts, dropped out of school, the same thing you're seeing happen again and again, and they got locked up. And in Worcester County, where I grew up, there were a lot of brown and black people in prison, but there were a lot of white kids too. And so from my perspective, it's always been a poverty and an opportunity issue. And so from a Koch perspective, the way Charles Koch and David Koch look at the world, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's fundamental liberty, and it's also about giving people a chance and removing the barriers to opportunity so we can have a society where the external barriers, whether it's a criminal justice system that does way too much, that doesn't need to do what it's doing that much, the over-criminalization, the number of laws we have, the long sentences for people not based on data but just based on fear, all of those things, we're looking at it with data-driven practices. And for us at Koch, it's all about trying to help people improve their lives. And this is a major impediment to a lot of people in this country. We've got, maybe 2 million people or so in prison today, and all the people with criminal records. We treat people who have been in prison and incarcerated with such stigma and made them second-class citizens. It's not healthy, it's not right, and we're losing a lot of competitiveness as well. I mean, there's a huge skill gap in this country for skilled labor, for companies like ours. And now you're seeing a lot of prisons starting to train people on that while they're in prison so they come out better. So for us, this is just one way to make it a better society and a safer society. And again, the bottom line, at the end of the day, a criminal justice system is designed to keep people and communities safer. It should also provide equal justice. And then it also needs to be redemptive and based on rehabilitation and restoration, and not on punitive measures. That doesn't work. And I think that's changing. It doesn't seem like it all the time. It's maybe not changing enough. But that is the trend in the future, and I think this is generational. I really do, particularly at the federal level, when we start to wash out some of the folks that, you know, put those laws in place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's going to change. And that'll be good for society, because there's so much more we need to work on just besides reforming our criminal justice system.
Thank you. Jeffrey, I want to pick up on the idea of redemption, reentry. How much traction do you have with your fellow business leaders in Philadelphia and nationally? Do you think you're the tip of the iceberg, or do you think you're out there on your own?
Well, I hope I'm the tip of the iceberg. But you know, you read the paper and you watch movies, and it portrays someone that makes a mistake as a rare, broken person that can't be fixed. And it's not that way. It really, I mean, there might be a small percentage that really have some psychological issues, but most of the people that I've come in contact with are not that way. They don't have psychological issues. A lot of them were never drug users. It was the job that was available. And so I've spent time with lots of employers. And I think the only way to do this is you can't completely train an employer's mind instantly, because they have a life of fear about this whole situation. And what I encourage them to do is hire one person. And I think, you know, you owe it to society to take a chance on one person. And I think the one person will lead to complete change over time. And that's what we, you know, in UpLift, where we do this nonprofit workforce work, we have recruited new employers that are very hesitant. And we said start out with one person. And let's see how the one person goes and take it from there. Because look, all these fears have been built up over decades. And I think in all fairness to the employers, they're uninformed, but they haven't had any real life experience to suggest their old knowledge is wrong. And I think, you know, our evidence and other employers, the Koch Industries evidence, should be enough for employers to open their eyes, and then they got to learn for themselves. The other thing that I think is occurring, which I think is going to help accelerate this, is if you've noticed, unemployment is really low right now. And it is very difficult to get employees in almost every field, and entry-level employees are the hardest it's been in many decades. And I think this might be a good reason for employers to open their mind, because I'm hearing around the country there's restaurants are closing, lack of help. There's other industries that depend on entry-level work that can't open their doors because they don't have help. So which risk do you fear more? Not opening your doors at all, or you want to take a chance on one person and learn something about humanity and what really is going on? So I think I'm the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you. Robert, I want to come back. I want to come back to you. I know that you're aware of the critique of our reform-minded DA in this city and other progressive DAs around the country. The critique that says we already have one public defender's office. We don't need two. We need the prosecutor focused on the rights of victims, not the rights of the accused. And I want to give you the opportunity to sort of respond to that. And I also want to mention something that sort of came up pretty recently as we prepared to tape this episode. The Washington Post released a study of murder in America's largest cities over the last 10 years, over 50,000 cases of homicide in that period, and found that there was only an arrest or prosecution in about half of the cases. So there are literally thousands of unsolved murders, tens of thousands, people getting away with murder, literally. Shouldn't that kind of thing be the focus of America's DAs rather than how to get people out of jail?
The duty of a prosecutor is to be a minister of justice, to ensure that the prosecutor undertakes the protection of the constitutional rights of all citizens, including defendants who appear in court. Now, the prosecutor is supposed to be able to hold all parties to the justice system accountable, including law enforcement. And law enforcement has a duty and a role to ensure that it stays in its lane and does the things it's supposed to do. And one of the things it does is it provides evidence that it gathers at the time of arrest to the prosecutors. Now, the prosecutors are supposed to provide, or the law enforcement is supposed to provide all the evidence, and all that evidence under the rules of discovery are supposed to be provided to the defense. It is our duty and our responsibility as a prosecutor to ensure that that's done, so that those homicide cases that come up can be prosecuted fairly. We in Philadelphia are aware of some cases that have recently come to the forefront, including the recent settlement, where that wasn't done fairly, and where evidence that was brought forward was not properly investigated, DNA, and as a result, a gentleman spent 20-some years in jail, and unfairly so. So we have to do that part of it. Otherwise, the city is going to face enormous liabilities. Now, in terms of being a good prosecutor, Larry Krasner is committed to being a good prosecutor to ensure that those kinds of cases, violent cases, and other serious felonies are properly prosecuted. We have still about 70–80% of the prosecutors who were in the office prior to us coming. We're hiring the best and brightest people that we can find. We're bringing and developing one of the best training programs for prosecutors in the nation, bringing experts from across the country to make sure that we're doing a good job. And we expect to have one of the best trained and best offices in terms of execution of prosecutions in the nation. Now, we also expect to make sure that we focus on the reality of where we are. We're one of the poorest cities in the nation. And we do not believe that people who are poor should be placed in jail and held there prior to trial, prior to determination of guilt, where there's a presumption of innocence, without being able to get out on bail. So we are in the business of bail reform. We also believe that when people go to jail, that we should try and find fair sentences. So Larry Krasner has set forth a policy of imposing sentences on the lower end of the guidelines so we don't place people in jail for inordinate periods of time. He's also set forth a policy on restricting the length of probation. Why? Because Philadelphia happens to be, I believe, the second or third largest city or place in the nation for probation. We place more people on probation here in the city and county of Philadelphia than practically any place else in the nation. And with so many people on probation, all we're doing is extending the time when people are under court supervision, making it difficult for them, after they've paid their debt to society, to be able to be in a position to develop their families, to get jobs, and be responsible citizens. So we're aware of some of the tools that we have at our disposal, sentencing, probation, expungements, that we can use to help end mass incarceration and end mass supervision, because mass supervision is as much of a problem as mass incarceration. There's no reason to place somebody on probation for 10, 20 years after they've been in jail for 10 or 15 years. What's the point? It doesn't really. What the research tells us is that once a person is on probation after 2 or 3 years, if they haven't violated probation, they're unlikely to violate probation. What we've done is made it impossible for them to live productive lives. So yes, there is a role and responsibility for prosecutors to prosecute homicides and other serious felonies and other serious cases. But we also have a duty to be protectors of the Constitution, protectors of the presumption of innocence, protective of the rights of poor people to be able to live in this society and to have a way of going about doing that without being under state and court supervision.
Thank you. So I want to do 2 questions that are for everybody, and we'll start on one end and the one on the other end on the other. So the first question is about really the politics of making the kind of transformation that you all are in consensus is needed. Richard Nixon, 1968, Donald Trump, 2016, both campaigned literally using the same language in which they said the most basic civil right is the right to feel safe, to be safe in your home, on the street, to be safe in your person and in your property. That is the fundamental civil right. The precondition for the exercise of any other civil right is safety. And correlated, the primary responsibility of government, number one responsibility of government, is to protect that right to feel and to be safe. Both of them won those elections. So there is clearly still a law and order, literally those terms, law and order constituency in the United States that is large. How can the things that you all agree should be done get done? I'm going to start with you, Mark, and we'll go around.
Because it's worked in the States, you said earlier. And so, I mean, I think everybody here is okay with law and order. I mean, we want an orderly society. We want the rule of law. It's just a matter of what laws are we talking about, and how are they enforced, and what is the punishment, and what are the repercussions after that. So from my perspective, I'd say that what we've seen, again, in the States, and it's going up to 30 states or so almost that have done criminal justice reform, they've changed that. And really, at the end of the day, it isn't about tough on crime or soft on crime. I'm repeating myself. It's about being smart on crime and soft on taxpayers based on data-driven and evidence-based practices. And yeah, we're going to have people in our society who break the law that need to be incarcerated. But that doesn't mean we should be giving them a life sentence either in real time for a nonviolent offense like that we do, particularly at the federal level around drugs, which is crazy, or basically the virtual life sentence, because you can't get a job, you can't get housing, you can't do anything. And what we need to do is have a redemptive system. And and the hope would be that we'd have a lot fewer people coming to prison if we put more money into our schools and into other programs to keep people out to begin with. But once they're in prison, we need to make that investment as well, not just warehousing people and locking them up. That's why there's a prison reform bill at the federal level that had a resounding vote, the First Step Act, 360 to 59 in the House that passed, and it's going on to the Senate. I hope it passes. We want more than that. We want more than just prison reform, but it's a good start. We want sentencing reform. We want a lot more than that. But the reality is that having, and it's part of me is like, why do we have to pass laws for, to rehabilitate people? Why wouldn't we just do that anyway, the amount of money we're spending? But that has to happen. And then part of that bill is another thing that drives me just insane. We're going to pass a law that says that pregnant women who are inmates can't be shackled while they're giving childbirth. I mean, that's crazy that we have to pass a law for that. But we do. So it's important that law passes, that bill passes. But that's not going to be enough. Training people up is great, but if no one hires them, that's not going to be sufficient. So what we're really focused on is reentry and reentry programs. We have one, we started a pilot program that's actually in a couple of counties here in Pennsylvania called Safe Streets and Second Chances. And our whole goal is we're working with the state. We have a pilot program of 1,100 people, and we're going to have the people coming out get what the state already provides in their systems for reentry. And then we're going to have our program working with local providers here in Pennsylvania and see who gets better outcomes over time. Our hope is that we're successful and we can scale it up and go all 50 states, but we'll see what happens. It's a partnership with Right on Crime, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Koch Industries, Charles Koch Institute, and Florida State University, where our chief researcher is. The bottom line is our goal is to have reentry begin day one of incarceration, because that's when it needs to start, not 12 months out, not 6 months out. But these practices have worked in the states and the work at the federal level, and the tough on crime stuff. Maybe I don't think it wins elections anymore. The Trump thing. I don't know what that was. I don't think it was necessarily the tough on crime thing. But I will say in Virginia, Gillespie did some pretty tough on crime ads near the end of the campaign, and he lost. So I think that people are wising up to that.
Thank you. Jeff.
So from my perspective, change requires leadership. And what you noticed in our party system, if you fall under a certain party, you tend to believe in all the exact same things, which seems like almost inhuman that you would believe in exactly the same things. And so I think it does take leadership, and I don't think that leadership comes from elected officials. I think it comes from people on this panel and other leaders in society who push them, who push back at them. So that's the first thing. The second thing that Mark talked about is data. And most things we do successfully have some scientific element, have a data element. And I'm convinced that the data very clearly shows that our system of mass incarceration, long sentences, makes us less safe, because when people leave, they can't come back to society ever. So they can never get their record cleared. No one will hire them. It's almost a recipe for almost 100% chance of reincarceration. So the current system we have now is really making us less safe, and I think it takes leadership to explain to people that you won't be safe until people that have no opportunity have an opportunity. And if they have an opportunity and they could prosper, they're going to be like everyone else, and they're not going to do things that are going to hurt you. And right now the system we have is maximizing people that are hopeless and that have a high probability of committing a crime because we've left them no other choice. And so people should join us and lead this, because the more leaders we have that start to say, it's just clear this doesn't make sense. It isn't making us safer. We need to change it.
So in the introduction, what we heard was true. This is kind of like what prisons look like. The only thing is you can't hear. You can't hear what they sound like. 80% of people who are locked up are either mentally ill or addicts. You could say that prisons are the largest provider of mental health services, except they don't actually provide those services, most of them. So imagine those sounds. You can't smell it. When I was a prosecutor and I used to go to a prison to interview a witness, first thing I would do when I left was go home and take a shower. Prisons stink. Prisons are miserable places. That's part one. Part two is our conversation that I have with my sister, who is married to a French guy. They lives in France, and she's becoming kind of French. She thinks everything there is better than here. And she just got her citizenship. And I said, Kimberly, you got to make sure it's dual citizenship. She said, well, I've been living in France for 25 years. What is it? I said, I'm proud to be an American. She said, why? I said, I'm proud because of hip-hop music, because of jazz, because of Apple Computer. What we are as Americans, we're optimistic, we're innovative, we're creative, and we dream big. So I think about those two problems together. How can we dream big? How can we be optimistic and innovative about getting rid of these wretched places? And there are things we can do. So abolition does not mean opening the door to every prison tomorrow and letting everybody go home. Think about it as a process of gradual decarceration, with the eye of always keeping us safe, but locking up as few people as possible. It's not a new idea. It's been around since prison's been created. Charles Dickens was an abolitionist after he visited places like this. So what is it that we hope prison does? We hope that it keeps us safe from people who would hurt us if they weren't locked up. And when people have caused harm, when they've done bad, we hope it makes them accountable for what they've done. Those of us who've worked in the system know that prison doesn't do either of those very well. And so then the question is, how can we use our American ingenuity to think of ways to do it better? And what this place is about, where we are now, it's kind of about our optimism, right? Because before this place existed, the way that we punished people who did bad was we killed them, or we hurt their bodies, or we banished them. We made them leave the community and never come back. So this was an experiment to say, okay, people make mistakes, but is there a way that we can deal with those that respects their humanity? Experiment is 200 years old. We now know it hasn't worked really well. So now it's time to think about the next thing. And the wonderful news there is there are communities all over the country working in that problem. Common Justice is a community organization based in Brooklyn. They have a deal with the DA there. When people, it's usually guys, have caused harm, if the victim agrees, case comes out of the criminal legal process and goes to this community organization, Restorative Justice. And there, the man who's caused the harm, he's got to make it up to the victim in a way that she feels that she's being respected. She can never be made whole again. But he's got to do the best he can, and he's got to take steps in his mind, with his body, to make sure he's not going to hurt anybody else. You're right, it is about evidence, not about emotion. The data suggests that this program works way better than prison. It's hard work, therapy, sitting down, dealing with your stuff. Sometimes guys in the middle of it, they say, man, I wish I'd gone to prison because this is too hard. But it works way better. That's American ingenuity. That's the vision. 50 years from now, we're not going to be putting people in cages because we're going to know it didn't work. So the quest is to get to that day.
Thank you.
The district attorney in Brooklyn is Eric Gonzalez, if I'm correct?
Yes.
A progressive prosecutor who has adopted restorative justice. One of Larry Krasner's visions for Philadelphia is to bring restorative justice. In fact, we have a national expert, Sujatha Balagar, who's coming here on the 25th to begin working with our staff to find ways of bringing restorative justice to Philadelphia. I think that we don't have to look far into the future to see reform and transformation that's actually working. I think we need to stop for a moment and look on our juvenile justice side. I spent 4 years in Washington working for the President for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And there I was able to see that this artificial red state, blue state divide really blinds us sometimes to progress being made throughout the nation. You have states like Georgia, Kentucky, South Dakota, Kansas where you come from, West Virginia, Massachusetts as well. Well, you can't. Last time we talked, it was Kansas. Utah.
Are doing better. So.
And Utah, where a lot of progress has been made to reform, Virginia, transform their juvenile justice systems, where they've cut the number of children being arrested in half, the number of kids going to placement by more than half. Costs there, sometimes running $200,000 to $300,000 per year per child for secure confinement, have been eliminated. New York closed down 24 of its juvenile justice facilities in the state and leaving about 10 there, and brought their kids back to the city of New York, where they now keep them in placement facilities close to home. So we've seen not just reform, but fundamental transformation in that system, dramatically reducing the cost, reducing the number of kids in placement, and getting much, much better outcomes. We've also seen a lot of this on the adult side. And I think that we need to be sure to take a close look at examples in our own nation that are working, where evidence-based practices that have been carefully examined and studied by lots and lots of experts, have shown us the way. We just have to be careful and read up on these things, look at what's working, adopt some of those practices that are working right here in our own city, and we'll find that we can bring about the change that is just waiting on our doorsteps to bring about. I want to emphasize something that's really important from what I've been able to see. When Mr. Krasner got elected, I talked to a lot of folks in our city who felt that he was bringing a sense of hope and optimism that we could change our system here in Philadelphia. That hope and optimism can be infectious sometimes. But he knows as well as I do that we need the support of the citizens of this city continuously, both to follow what he's doing, but also to hold his feet to the fire and make sure that we are doing the things that people ask us to do as prosecutors in the city. So we welcome comments, we welcome participation, we welcome intervention, we welcome suggestions and ideas about how to do this right, but we want to know that we're trying to do those things that he promised that we would do when he got elected. So the reforms are not pie in the sky. They're not beyond our reach. They're not things we can't do. We have to be careful, thoughtful. We have to use the evidence and knowledge that's available, use the best experts, and we need your support, the support of people in the city who keep pushing us to get it right. So I don't think it's far off. I don't think it's the next generation. I don't think that I have to wait for my sons and daughters to see this. I want to see it right now. The reason I'm involved right now is because I want to see it during my lifetime come to fruition. So those are some thoughts. We have a sense of urgency, a sense of really feeling like every day is a day that we need to invest every ounce of energy we can into this process, and that's what we're doing. So.
Gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for being with us on The Whole Truth. Wonderful discussion, and we appreciate all your insights.